Today is Friday, March 29th, 2024, and you have once again found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here, as always, or 99% of the time, with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, spring has returned. How are you doing?
Oh, it has. It's wonderful. Other than the pollen. I could do without the pollen, but, it's great. It's been beautiful, beautiful day.
What topic are we trying to unravel today?
Well, today we're kind of doing a sequel to an older episode. I want to say it's episode 23. It was a long time ago. It's kind of funny because the way you started that you're here 99% of the time, because the first time we did this topic, you were not here. Mr. Sandor was sitting in as guest co-host, and we liked that one. And honestly, it's one I'd like to revisit from time to time. But today we're going to be talking about what we wish we knew when we were younger, when we were teens and young adults ourselves, what we wish we could go back in time and convey that knowledge to us at that age. That's what we're going to talk about.
That sounds good. That'll be a fun thing to go through.
We'll find out. Thank you, Jake and Julia. And during our little break there, where we'll put the music in, Mr. Robinson just said, well, you sounded kind of skeptical at the end there.
We'll see, maybe.
Well, let's say this. We have picked it because we do think it's profitable for sure. I just, I like to keep, I don't know what they say. If you keep expectations low, it make them easier to exceed. That sounds terrible.
Well, there's many things. Every so often, it's just a mental exercise. I don't know when. Like, you're waiting for something or whatever. And I will think back through, not so much middle school anymore, but high school. I'll sometimes pick it up in high school, and I'll think about, with just a little more effort, I could have done better in some of my classes and had way less trouble, things like that.
Right.
And, we made a lot of money mowing lawns every summer, and yet by the first semester of high school, I'd blown all the money. So kind of wish I'd been sharper with my money, things like that.
All right. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. And I did look it up during our quick mini break. It was episode 23. So we're currently on episode, well, what is this one? Episode 93. We got our 100th episode coming up, Mr. Robinson. So really 70 episodes ago, we addressed this topic, it was just at the time, it was because you were out, it was me and Mr. Sandor just talking about what it is things that we wish we had known. And this might surprise you, dear listener, but a lot of things I wish I knew back then. It's not like I was a ball of wisdom in my teens and young adult years and that only had a few things to put in place. So I don't think that I'll be repeating anything this time. I think I'll be giving you some new ones. So I would encourage you, after you've heard this one, if you haven't heard that one back, that we didn't have nearly as many listeners back then, feel free and head out there and listen to that. The sound quality may not be as good. We had like an older mic, for instance, but hopefully the content is just as strong as you've come to appreciate from Living Youth.
Mr. Smith, to help me get up to speed, took the transcript from that podcast, ran it through ChatGPT, and which generated a summary and also key points so that I could know, what you talked about. Just the quickest and easiest way to know what had been covered before.
Yeah, well, I didn't expect you to have to watch the whole thing again, but I do have this thing that'll summarize a video with ChatGPT, and it's fascinating. It actually can't take the entire transcript, so it does selections from the transcript. But it's remarkably, it really does a pretty decent job, which makes you wonder how many words you're wasting, but it actually did a pretty decent job. So was it help you?
Yeah, no, it helped a lot. I was commenting to you beforehand how I found this kind of humorous because it's really like the summary is really quite good, and it talks about how on August 10th, 2022.
You're reading now, right?
Well, yeah, I'm reading from it. It says the podcast episode titled "What We Wish We'd Known" from the Living Youth Podcast, dated August 10th, 2022, features Wallace Smith and guest co-host Mark Sandor, who filled in for the absent Mr. Robinson. and then one of the key points on the host background, it says it again, calls me out again. Wallace Smith and guest co-host Mark Sandor, who replaced the unavailable Mr. Robinson. It's almost like if it had said due to his illness and weak constitution was not available, I wouldn't have been surprised.
Due to his weak little body that couldn't fight off whatever bug it was.
Exactly.
So it's so weird reading AI picked up on that from our video. Okay. So here we go. So that's our goal. We're going to just talk about a few things. The number is indiscriminate. We'll see what we get through. But we're going to talk about a few things that we wish we knew. And when I say know, It's not just head knowledge. We're talking about putting into action in your life when we were younger. And I'll go ahead and start and say the first thing that I wish I had appreciated and understood is I wish when I was a teenager and young adult, I wish I had realized how important it is to learn some physical, practical skills, like just simple home repair. You open a door too strong and you end up punching through your drywall or something with the doorknob. Attending to your car in certain ways. And I will say I had teachers. I didn't have to miss out on this. I had my stepdad eventually once I started going to college. The guy that became my stepdad, he was eager to teach me stuff like that. He was fantastic, and he tried here and there. I've packed the bearings and the wheels of my car. I've changed my own oil. I've done some of those things, and yet I didn't fully grasp how important it was to actually truly learn these things and master things. And it doesn't have to be everything, but just because I was always a pencil and paper kind of guy. I was always the bookworm. I was always that kind of realm. It was definitely mine. I enjoy that. I could still work in that realm, and yet now as an adult, I'm far more dependent on others than I wish I were. Than I wish I didn't have to be, and also when it comes to serving other people, let's say someone in our parking lot, they're having car trouble. Well, I can get on the phone and call somebody. Mm-hmm. That's about it. But I can't actually look.
Or wish them well as you drive off.
Exactly. I'll pray for you. James talks about you praying, you don't do anything about it. And I just don't have those skills. And honestly, my wife does. My wife was one of 3 girls, sisters, and their dad was a handyman extraordinaire. He could do really jack of all trades. I wouldn't say master of none. I'd say master of one at least. He was great at HVAC. But, he could do a little bit of everything. And he didn't have any boys. And all those 3 girls, they did all that kind of stuff. And they worked hard and they learned a lot of things. And so regrettably, I find myself having to lean on her to do some of these things. And it is definitely not my manliest trait. So that's one thing I wish I could do. I wish I did back then. I wish I'd recognized this may not be your natural bent, but it is worth the time and energy to invest and learn these practical physical skills. Be able to work with your hands. You won't regret it.
I could not agree more. I myself have my own regrets. So for example, we, as I already mentioned, my brother and we mowed lawns for close to 10 years. Made a lot of money. Didn't save a lot of money, but I'm using 4 and 2 cycle engines all the time, and I barely knew how to maintain them. Mm-hmm. And that was a real missed opportunity because that's what we're doing. I should have learned how to do it. Now, my dad wasn't a real mechanical guy, but my uncle was. So there were avenues, and there's all kinds of things like that I wish I'd paid more attention to. And so if I would go back and tell myself this, which I would, since part of the point of this exercise is to encourage our younger listeners, man, if you have an opportunity, you will never be sorry that you know how to do handyman things, ever.
You will not regret that.
Never. A car, your lawnmower inside your house, even like a basic understanding of electrical work is helpful. It doesn't mean you're going to do a whole big thing, but having the basic understanding of how to do it is very helpful. In fact, one of the things I really appreciated was here at LE, and I think this is often Mr. Tolmack who does this, but I've seen, one year I saw them, he put it on this rolling cart, and they built 3 dry walls and ran electricity and the whole deal. And so the kids learned that. This year I saw them, he had a whole lawnmower engine, not dirty by the way, and how to disassemble it and how it works and the basics of it, because a lawnmower engine is actually not super complicated if somebody shows you around.
If you know, and if you don't know, it's a mystery, and if something goes wrong, and it's like, well, I guess I got to get another lawnmower, right?
He also taught the boys, I think, I'm not sure exactly what they replaced, but it was something like an alternator. So,
and Mr. Braddock did some of that. I remember Mr. Julian Braddock would have, you look out in the parking lot, and they got a car up on blocks or whatever. But anyway, he's got them there looking at it all and showing them things, and I'm glad my son David's going through. He probably knows things now I don't.
I showed my nephew, this is probably 6 or 7 years ago, we stayed at my brother's house while they were out of town and watched his kids, but his oldest son was 18 and his brakes were real bad. So that's one thing I know how to do. And so we went down to the store, got all the parts, we changed his brakes, and I really was investing in him because it was one of the things I told him. I was like, you want to know how to do things. Otherwise, as you said, you have to rely on other people to do it.
Right.
You know, and that just limits your options. And at least even being knowledgeable about it protects you, because, you know, if you go down to a mechanic and he tells you something you just know is crazy, that can even help. Even if you're not going to do the work, being knowledgeable about how these things are done will always benefit you.
Yeah.
I'm sure the women have similar things that they would fall in. I mean,
I'm sure.
Most of the women are not going to learn how to
change an alternator.
Change an alternator.
Right. Some of them might. Some of the things like, hey, I know how to. Hey, good for you. You know, again, like my wife knows how to do some things I don't, and yet there's definitely things in each arena that I know some ladies that wish they had picked up some particularly feminine skills that they just didn't. And we used to have schools that would teach those things, but nowadays, unless you're going into, say, vocational studies or something, they just don't, and that's too bad. That really is too bad. All right, now you've got one for us, Mr. Robinson. What's yours?
So this originally was not number one, but I moved it up because it correlated with the one you just did.
Okay, cool.
Which was, so I don't always have the greatest titles, but I would go back. So we're going back in time, right? This is the exercise, and our older self was talking to younger self, and we're trying to convince us that some things matter, or you will care about certain things. At least that's the way I looked at it. And one of them was, you will care about knowing things later. So when I'm going through high school, all I care about is going through high school. I just want to do what I had to do to get through high school, because I wasn't that interested in the learning.
Okay.
It's not like I was entirely uninterested, and I really liked my history classes. I liked the literature assignments. There were things I did, but man, did I ever mail it in with math in particular. And so that's one of the things I start with. The irony of not being strong at math was I went into printing, which is you use math all the time.
You had to use a lot.
I had to use a lot of math. Well, it wasn't ever advanced math, but at the same time, wouldn't I kind of like to know, be a little further along in mathematics? When I was in high school, and I had one teacher in particular that loved the literary devices, and she's trying to teach us really well, like what a metaphor is and what a simile and all these things, and I just did not care. I did not care. And I read the books. I found the stories interesting. I enjoyed reading them. But here I am, 40 years later, let's see if that's right, 35 years later, and as I'm studying the Bible, which is full of literary devices, I wish I'd paid more attention in high school. This is not a new one. People say this all the time, but like, I wish I'd stuck with piano lessons. I wish I'd stuck with, there were options to learn foreign languages when I was going through. I think you had to take a couple years. But a lot of people go through high school having taken French or Spanish for 3 or 4 years and don't know a lot. But there's just lots of things where when you're younger, and especially if you were like me, which I was tended to not be very future focused. The old thing, when am I ever going to use long division? Okay, maybe you won't, but maybe you will. Yeah. And mathematics is more than just long division. Mr. Smith, you should speak on this. If I suspect you'll have comments, but like,
I will.
People underestimate how often you actually use mathematics, and they just surround us all the time and being knowledgeable. And I know a lot of people are going to be thinking, I love math. Okay, great. That's fine. I did not love math, but I regret not applying myself more and getting a more well-rounded understanding of mathematics. And one of the things I've learned in talking to you and actually talking to Chris Pringle, because with you it was math and with Chris Pringle it was music. And it actually helped me understand the theory behind both versus like the more applied kind of idea where, if you want to learn music, here first, let's memorize the notes. And here's Chris Pringle was like, here's what we're trying to do with music. It's you build tension in a song and then you resolve it. Like there's a pattern to it. You're like, oh, that's really cool. And talking to you many times about mathematics, I started to realize, maybe if I'd understood a little better what we're trying to do with mathematics. I mean, some of it's obvious, right?
Right.
If you want 10 M&Ms and you have 5 in one bowl, how many do you need? That's very practical. But there's a whole other side of it that's absolutely fascinating. But I don't think I could have convinced myself at that age that it was fascinating. But I You will, some of these opportunities you have that you pass on, going back to point one a little bit, you will wish you knew how to do these things later. Take advantage
Okay.
of your opportunities.
Yeah, those do go together really well. I'll say, yeah, if I had been a bit more curious about the things that I wasn't naturally curious about, I would have picked up a lot more of those things. I didn't have a natural curiosity about how to do a lot of physical. I know my grandfather had great skills. He built our whole fence, if I recall, once, and that wasn't even my dad, but if I'd have been, and how much would my grandfather have loved to show me? But having a curiosity, how do I put it? A curiosity that drives you in such a way that you don't have to be fascinated by a subject, but willing to go, that may not be my forte, but I'd like to know more about that. It does remind me of a proverb. One of my favorites in Proverbs 25. It says in Proverbs 25, verse 2, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter." And God knows everything, but there's a glory that belongs to kings, which is that desire to seek out this knowledge that's kind of hidden, that's there. And I'll give you some you can decide if it's credit or not, but I can definitely testify to the fact that it's been fun. Your real curiosity about math. These, here at our age now, we'll say something, you'll say, "Hey, I bet there's a mathematical way to think about this or that," or something will be mentioned, and you'll ask some questions, and next thing you know, we're kind of doodling on the whiteboard about it, and I've enjoyed that. That's actually been that's been a sincere, a lot of fun.
You do a good job of explaining it in a way. I don't want to be too dismissive of my teachers, but math teachers tend to attract math teachers. Very serious. The people that like to balance the formula, but I don't know. But sometimes you get somebody like you who's just, you have fun with it, and I don't know.
Oh, well,
the teaching does matter.
Well, and math is a very. I know when I was teaching, they were really trying hard to make it more where the teacher was more the facilitator. But of all subjects, I know math is very teacher centered, and if you don't have a great teacher, or a teacher's not excited about it, it makes a huge impact.
This is actually a true story. So I had, I think this was 8th grade, 7th or 8th grade. I had undiagnosed that my eyes had gone bad.
Oh,
and
wow.
I could not see the chalkboard clearly from my seat. And so once I realized I really couldn't see it, I finally asked the math teacher, who had us sitting in alphabetical order, if I could move up closer to the chalkboard, and she said, "No, we sit in alphabetical order."
Ah, wish you'd have known.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I did get glasses later, and it was when I put on glasses for the first time, I was blown away on how poor my eyesight had become.
Oh,
Didn't know it.
One more thing before we move on to the next thing is that if you do have that kind of willingness to know about things and to be curious and to follow paths that aren't your natural paths, but yet is clearly a realm you don't know, be willing to go down that ways. It also contributes to relationships with people, because the world is filled with people who have expertises that are not yours and may not be something you're naturally curious about. But if you can bring a curiousness to the table about those things, you can find that for those who are looking for conversational topics with people they've just met, being willing to kind of dive in, not just dive in faking it, but dive in naturally wanting to know more, about a subject like that. It does make a difference. Some of my favorite conversationalists have been those who have a great way of coming across like they're genuinely interested in what it is that you do, and that's something you can cultivate.
Yeah. Well, I would argue that, so what that reminds me of is our podcast we had with Mr. Wahhabitz. How does he know so many things? How does he seem to at least be knowledgeable on nearly everything? He was curious, interested, read widely.
Was willing to pay attention when something's being explained. Yep. That is when I get frustrated when I don't know something. I realize, man, someone was just explaining that to me like a year ago, and I can't believe I don't remember any of it. Okay, here's my next one. For me, I wish I had understood, and let me qualify that. I did understand it. The math is obvious, so the math is not a question. But I wish I'd understood to the point of using it, because using it is different than just knowing it. I wish I had truly embraced the time value of money. And I use that phrase because when I was studying as an actuary, that's what you see, is that money doesn't just have the value it has right now. It has time value, because that value varies in time. And I wish I had recognized at the time the power of a real saving habit when you're young. That is, a dollar you have at 15 is, you hold on to that, or there's things you can do where it's not a dollar at 35. It's more than a dollar now, depending on what you do with it and how you invest it. That sounds, I don't just mean like finding stocks and bonds and getting complicated, but I wish I'd understood that. And also the inverse. If you take on some debt at a young age, I'm just going to borrow $10. Well, if you don't deal with that, later on, it's not just $10, and the $10 that you borrowed that you end up having to pay back, when you have to pay that back, you really might want to do something else with that $10 instead of pay that back. The Bible talks about how the borrower is servant to the lender. And if you ever get in any kind of debt, you start to recognize, I really am a servant. I mean, it's not like a feudal system or something, or it's not like I'm literally enslaved. But yes, in a very real way, you no longer get to choose what you do with your money, because some of that money is already pre-obligated to go to the debtor. So there are some proverbs that do come to mind, like Proverbs 21:10, where it says no, that's not it. Not Proverbs 21:10. Where do I want to go? Mr. Robinson, what's one of those verses? There's two where it talks about how the prudent man foresees evil.
That's your other one.
That's really that one?
27:12 was a prudent man foresees evil and hides himself.
Oh, okay, that's right, because there's so many. So what was that meant for 21:10? Let me actually read it.
That's a good question, because that's very different than.
I have no idea what I was even trying to say with that one. Let's pretend I didn't say 21:10. I won't edit it out. We'll leave that for you guys to be able to see. But Proverbs 27:12 is definitely an example that the prudent man foresees evil and hides himself. Now you might think, what does that mean, evil? Like, what? Evil here can also be kind of something more broad, but consider there's so much in the future. You have no idea what that's going to be. You don't know the value of houses in the future. Are they going to be more expensive? They're going to be less expensive. Is there just something you're going to want in the future that you wish you could get? I would say, for our sake, for instance, I remember crossing a line in our lives where I recognized, oh no, if I don't put aside money for my children's education, whether it's college or anything else, I'm not going to have much at all. And actually, by the time that really sank in the way it should, there just wasn't much for me to be able to set aside. And I'm not sad that my children worked through college. That their working education was very helpful for them, and it was very helped them focus on being productive. But at the same time, I wish I'd been able to provide more. But you make those decisions when you're young, and when you ignore the time value of money, that's the one thing you can't make up for. When you're 40, you can't add the time value of savings to the money you save at 40. Mm-hmm. You have to have saved it at 20 or at 18 or at 15 to allow the time value to accumulate to that. And even if it's just some of these kind of small interest rate things, like a money market fund at your bank instead of a checking account or something, just I wish I had realized that when I was young, because now I see my own sons in their 20s and recognize that there's things that they're going to choose to do with their money right now that they will either be delighted they did when they turn 35, 45, etc., or they will regret, and they will be on a podcast wishing, like I am now, that I could go back and talk to my young self and say, hey, don't just know it like a math equation. Actually do it. Actually learn to save money and learn to set it aside. So I wish I'd have known that.
So that reminds me of the exercise. I don't know if exercise is quite the right way to describe it, but I wish I could remember how old I was when I was first presented with this information. That was something like, if you, starting at the age of 18, saved $100 every month, I think, for the next 30 years, and you got some kind of very conservative compounding interest rate, which I don't remember what that was. By the time, 30 years later or something like that, you would have $1 million saved up. And to make your point, so let's say you couldn't start when you were 18. Let's say you waited till you were 30. Well, you'll never catch up to that. And even if it was something like, even if you doubled, what if you put in $200 a month instead of $100, but now you're 30, so you're 12 years behind, you still never catch where you were. The time's a critical factor. And
what we don't understand often naturally is the power of exponential growth and how it's not linear, because when your money earns some interest, then as long as it's still sitting there and the interest is sitting there, then the next time it's not just your original money earning interest, it's also the interest that has now earned more interest. And it seems small at first. And if I'd have thought about it, I'd actually would have brought some actual figures, but it's kind of reminiscent of the old thing, like, which would you rather have, $1 million or at the end of a month? Would you rather wait and have $1 million, or would you rather have $1 on the first day, and then $2 on the second day, and then $3?
The million, of course, Mr. Smith.
And you realize, no, man, I really want that doubling thing. Yeah. But when you really kind of look at it, it's not obvious until you get to the end, because the money starts skyrocketing because you're constantly doubling. Well, it's akin to that. It is a very similar kind of circumstance. And if you haven't done that math, you ought to just sit down and do it. It doesn't take long. And after a while, the numbers get so big, you're going to get tired of doing it.
That reminds me of another similar to this. You let me know if you think that there's some kind of correlation here. Is one of my regrets was, I grew up in the church, right? You didn't. So when you started learning about the truth, you were what, 16, 17, 18?
14.
Well, that's not bad. It's not bad. When I finally left my parents' home in a household, at 18, lived on my own, you'd be surprised how little I really understood what the church had taught in some ways. Like when you grow up and you just every week you keep the Sabbath, you just take that for granted, but you don't question really why you keep the Sabbath. At least I didn't. The holy days, I never, again, this was just a weakness of my youth. Wasn't that invested in understanding why we did it. It's just what we did. But the thing is, when you grow up and you get older and then you find the right person and then you start your family, guess what? You actually want, how are you going to govern your family? How are you going to raise your children? What moral and ethical knowledge should you bring to raising your family? Well, the church teaches you all of that. And I wish I'd paid more attention. Now, you can catch up, but still, just imagine, like, I feel like my girls have a much better leg up on this than I ever did. Like, I sometimes marvel at things they've considered or just, we're talking about something and they express something where you realize, and I've said this a bunch of times. I said this recently to Ella, and I said, man, it's amazing you're doing that. I said, I didn't even, trust me, at your age, I wasn't doing that, And so one day, the younger listeners, you do grow up. You will eventually likely end up with a spouse and a family, and you'll be wishing you'd paid a lot of attention to what you're being taught right now. Yeah. Because that's what you have. That's also what you need to pass on to your own children.
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a really good point. I couldn't help but do the math a little bit. The whole thing about having $1 on the first day of a month and then doubling to $2, the first week you've got a whole $127 or something.
I knew I should have taken the $1 million.
But it's even more than that. So rather than taking $1 million at the end of a month, what if you could be given, what was it? I think it's $30 million every day of that month.
Oh wow.
It's like,
instead
suddenly,
of the doubling thing?
Yeah, so the first guy takes that deal, and at the end of the first week, he's got $210 million, and you're coming away with $127. The doubling still wins in the end.
Wow,
you have more than $1 billion at the end of the month. It's actually phenomenal.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah, so
that's really good. Okay,
so now yours.
Here's mine, and I know because again, my daughter Maddie was very different than me in her her long-term outlook of life.
Okay.
Very different than mine. But believe it or not, especially for those of you who there's plenty of you that are not going to comprehend this, but some of you will. Some of you will know what I'm saying. It wasn't until I was about 23 that it occurred to me that I didn't have to learn everything in life the hard way.
Really?
I did learn everything the hard way. I had this unnatural belief that the consequences would not happen to me, that there's something amazing and special about me that I was going to avoid the consequences. Well, after 23 years of just getting battered by the consequences, and then and part of this really was, I didn't understand this till later, and we've mentioned this on the podcast before. Some of it was actually just a mature brain.
Okay.
That around your mid-20s, your brain development is complete, and the last thing to come online is the so-called executive function decision making, and that kicked in for me. But it was my mind was blown because my first thought was, okay, Robinson, think about this. What if? Now just stick with me here. What if we learn from other people's examples? I know up till now we've made it here by learning everything the hard way, just getting crushed here and there. But we could have a more like a more external outlook on life and a more long-term view, and listen to the people that you respect who are older than you that tell you, hey, if you do this, the most likely outcome is going to be X. Because I did not believe that those would be the most likely outcome. I'm probably overstating it a bit, but I'm telling you, in general, I just thought you had to learn everything the hard way. And I would go back in time and I would try to convince myself of this, but I tell you right now, I will not listen to future me. And I will still think future me is wrong. But if I could reach even one person today to convince them, boy, your parents actually know, believe it or not, what they're talking about. What's the Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, where it's like, when I was in my teens, I thought my dad didn't know anything, and then I went away for a while and had some experiences as an adult, and I came back, and my dad was a lot smarter.
Yeah, Mark Twain. It's attributed to Mark Twain saying that's exactly right. Right.
And that was it. Like you may think your minister's maybe old and stuffy, and what does he know? He's out of touch, out of tune. No, they've been through it. They've tried it. They were young once, believe it or not. That's a hard thing to convince a young me. It was like, I understand the concept is that an older person was one time younger and a child or a teen, but man, listen to people you respect who are older than you. They will give you good advice, and you should consider that is the way things will potentially turn out.
I don't know what's most fascinating about your saying this, but I could see you as a young man just not only learning things the hard way, but then coming to a point where you've discovered this idea that you could learn from other people's situations and mistakes. And hey, since the podcast really is about trying to think with a biblical mindset, we'll just emphasize that is very biblical thinking. The Bible all over the place is talking about doing that. One of my favorite examples in Proverbs 24, where Solomon is walking by a vineyard and looking at this guy's vineyard and looking at the state it's in, and he's trying to learn something. He doesn't want to just learn it the hard way. He wants to see what other people are going through and learn from that. Not to mention, even in the New Testament, Paul essentially says in 1 Corinthians 10, when he's talking about the Old Testament examples, when he says, now all these things happen to them as examples, and they're written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Really what he's saying is, you know what the whole purpose of Israel's experience fundamentally really was? So that you, my friend, would have the chance to learn from other people's examples. So you don't have to repeat those mistakes.
So great scripture, great point, because I'm sort of concluding going through, I know I've mentioned it before, but you go from the Exodus into the Promised Land, and then you have 440 years at the time of the Judges, and then almost another 400 years, I think, under the monarchy. And I'm well into 2 Kings. Most of Israel never seemed to learn that lesson. Some did. The Bible always brings out examples here and there of people who did get it and were doing it the right way, and they're upheld. But the real, the long-term lesson of Israel was that they never seemed to learn that lesson, that they didn't have to learn everything the hard way, and that they could actually just do it God's way, which not only is a better way, but it is the best way. And so thank you for bringing in a reminder to thinking biblically.
Oh yeah, which is, I ought to highlight that we're not going to have a Bible verse for everything we do, but at the same time, part of what we do here, I think, Mr. Robinson, and I think people have told us they appreciate this aspect of the podcast, is that it is a conversation. We're talking, and when you're naturally talking with people, you don't always think of a particular citation or reference. I mean, we're going to often, because that's what we do. But at the same time, you're trying to involve these principles, right? So I hope people will forgive us if we don't always have a citation for something. But at the same time, yeah, in that particular case, because I can't remember the first person who said it, but it was someone in the church who abbreviated it OPE, other people's experience. They said, man, you want to learn by OPE, dude. That's the way to learn.
Right.
And Mr. Hernandez, I can't think of the name of the sermon, but he had a whole sermon talking about that's what God really hoped. Adam and Eve learned their lessons, but he kind of hopes the rest of us are learning by watching them. We don't have to commit. So that's the consequences of sin. And he repeated that with a slightly different theme, but we can just learn from other people's experience. We don't have to follow in the same mistakes.
You could argue, I like the way Dr. Meredith put it. There are a number of different ways you could say, well, you know what it's all about? It's all about this. And that is some, like the Bible in some ways is all about, listen, you don't have to learn this the hard way. It's all been recorded from Genesis to Revelation, literally thousands of years of human experience. And you can, I love the way Mr. O'Gwyn used to put it. You had Abraham and then his family, and then it expands. And at a certain point, the story, because, the early part of the Bible really is kind of focused in on, Adam and Eve, and then down to Abraham, but then from Abraham's family expands out into a vast nation. And the story of Israel in the time of the judges and in the monarchy really is just recording the consequences. It's not, in this case, it doesn't have to always be negative, but just the result of when Israel did things the right way and when they didn't.
Yeah. None of us are going to be able to stand before Jesus Christ or God the Father and say, well, how'd you expect me to know that?
Yeah, right.
How do you expect me to know that? He's like, are you kidding? How can I make it more obvious? Okay, so let's see. I'll move to then mine. And this is the last one I have. I know Mr. Robinson might have one or two more. We're at least getting in, it looks like 3 of them. Good for us, Mr. Robinson.
Yes.
I wish, and I've thought about this frequently. Hope it doesn't sound like a downer. I don't mean it to be. It's not. But I sincerely wish that before, when my parents were still alive, when I was younger and I was in their care, I was in their house, I had free access to them. I had a very busy life. I was in theater. I was spending a lot of my time, my school and my grades and my friends. But what I had there were my parents. And unlike a lot of other things in my life, the clock was kind of ticking on them. You've only got so much time when you're in their house and you have that access. And I wished I had asked my parents when I was younger more questions about their lives when they were younger. Not just constantly drilling them about something, definitely specific things. If I'm going through something, asking them what it was like, if they ever went through something like that, but also just plain conversing with them, just I don't know, free, instead of talking about everything on my heart, asking them, like if a movie comes out, ask them about movies when they were a dish, or if I'm trying to figure out what to do, we're trying to figure out what to do for the weekend. What did they do on the weekends? What was fun for them? Both my parents are dead now, and I can't ask them a single thing without, like in the Bible, I guess they go to the witch of Endor and calling up a spirit, which won't be them. It'll be a demon of some sort.
And
so I won't do
discouraged.
that. That's very, very much discouraged. Good subtle word there, Mr. Robinson. So no, my parents I will not see again until the second resurrection. And how many times now? I turned 54 just recently. How many times here in the middle to the latter middle part of my life, do I just wish I could ask them something about their experience and the time they spent with us when we were young, or what they were thinking before they got married. It wasn't until like for instance, my dad's funeral. Actually, it wasn't his funeral. It was the visitation beforehand. It was the evening before, and so I was there, and there weren't a whole lot of people there. People kind of come and go, and it was generally pretty thin. But I saw people there that talked about my dad's time in high school with me that it wasn't until talking to them I realized I knew virtually nothing about my dad's time in high school, other than I knew some other people that were there. I knew some teachers. He actually shared some of his teachers. I had a teacher that he had. And this guy talked about a fight that he and my dad got in, and my dad really cleaned his clock, apparently. Huh. But here he was coming to my dad's, and I don't even know if my father had even talked to this man in all this time, but he saw his name in the paper and he came to pay his respects.
Wow.
It was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And he's talking about, he goes, oh man, yeah, your dad beat the tar out of me. I thought, oh man, this is my dad in some fist fight, which we're not encouraging fist fights, by the way. Just, my father didn't know any better, but there's a rough and tumble aspect of his life I didn't know. I knew some things secondhand, but when he was with me, I could have asked him. I could have talked about those things. And again, I'm not feeling super emotional about it. I'm just trying to say this as a fact that as an older person now, that time is gone. There was a window in my youth when I could have easily conversed with my parents about what life was like for them and how they felt about things. And if my dad expressed some political opinion of some sort and said, hey, did you feel that way when you were young too? Or, I don't know what you call your grandparents, Mr. Robinson. I called mine Nina and Papa, and be able to say, hey, were Nina and Papa like that too? I mean, just engaging. And on one hand, it might feel awkward because it's not normal, but the more I had done it, the more it would have been normal. And so for my kids, you've probably figured out, Mr. Robinson, I'm kind of a TMI sort of guy. I tend to share more information than I need to. And so I've probably shared lots about my past with my sons than maybe some others would. But I wish there's a proverb. Is it a proverb I wrote? Yeah, that might be. Let me look at this. I wrote down a note for myself, and I want to read it before I know what it says. Proverbs 20 and verse 5. Oh, yeah. Okay, I did think of this verse in relation to this. Proverbs 20 verse 5 is far more about getting advice. It's fairly narrow, but it says in Proverbs 20 verse 5, counsel in the heart of a man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. That is, what a person really thinks, the advice that he might have, the wisdom that he has is often kind of deep inside. And not everyone's out there just spouting it all the time or having a podcast about it. But it's worth it, the proverb says. It's worth it to get that man's counsel, to even if it takes some effort to dig deep and to bring it out of a person, it's worth the time it takes to bring it out. Well, I'm not just talking about counsel. I'm just talking about more knowledge of them and more knowledge of what their lives were like. Now, the fact is that would end up being a kind of counsel, because the more we know about our parents and frankly other people, the more it gives us the opportunity to even passively learn from other people's experience and to be able to use those to shape our decisions. But in the final take, if I allow myself to just, in terms of more sentimental take, I wish I knew my parents better. And of course I knew them. I spent 18 years plus, at least 18 years under their roof and more just interacting with them. And yet in the end, my time to get to know them in this life is forever gone. Well, gone until that resurrection. Right. And I wish I knew them better. So anyway.
How old were you when your father died?
Oh boy, I should be able to tell you exactly how old I was, but I was an adult. I was already in the ministry, and
okay,
yeah. But both my parents died in their 70s, early 70s, and so in fact, I did both my mother and my father's funeral. Dad's was pretty rushed because there wasn't a lot of money, and he was buried at a military place where they essentially told us, "All right, you got 5 minutes," and they're moving on to the next military guy. So that was actually pretty rushed. But I am grateful that I knew them. But the thing is, by then, man, I've got a wife, I've got kids, I'm a minister, I'm traveling everywhere. The time to leisurely get to know my parents was kind of the time. Let me say this: the time where the environment was such to make it easy was gone, and from that point on, I was going to have to invest. I was going to have to make sure there was time, and I was in my. Let's see. Like I said, they died in their early 70s, and so I was in my 40s. But I was only realizing, because they both died relatively unexpectedly, and it still hadn't hit me to the point. Like I probably could have invested a bit there, towards the end more, but at the same time, I've got so many responsibilities at that time. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I guess that's why I aim it at my youth and to our youth. Because now most of you are in an ideal environment. It's not like the number of responsibilities in your life are going to decrease. They're probably going to increase. And so this is a special time to invest to get to know your parents.
Yeah, you're right. Even if your relationship with your parents are strained at time, you will later in your life wish you had talked to them more and knew more stuff. As you can probably tell by some of my listing of what I wish I'd known. My high school and into my early 20s relationship with my father was very contentious. But when I figured out I didn't have to learn everything the hard way, and then after that, I was married about a year and a half later, 2 years later, and then all of a sudden because I fundamentally changed the way I approach things in life. I really did. It really was that one day I felt like I'd actually grown up and I could be more adult and more responsible. And so one thing I would mention to kids, there's a real possibility that even if your relationship is strained with your parents now or just at times and over the normal reasons that would be there, what I appreciated was when things flip and you get to have an adult relationship with your parents. You're not a kid anymore. In my case, I was married, and my dad died when I was 32, I think. So, yeah, that sounds about right. And so we'd had our first grandchild. I think Maddie was about 3 when my dad died. And so he got to see one of his grandkids, or several of his grandkids, because my sister was ahead of us. But those were like 7 priceless years for me, where I got to access my dad, who was no longer frustrated with me. I'm an adult now, and we had an adult relationship, and it was really fun. And I did take advantage of some of that. And I asked him things. He taught me a lot in a short period of time about things, because by then the role he served in his company as the CEO, I would ask him things about how to manage people and the outlook and things like that. Just wanted to understand. And then so he died when I was 32. Well, my mother is still alive. She just turned 80 last year. And I still can ask her. So I kind of had a bit of both in some ways. My father, my dad died relatively young compared to my mom, and a bit of both. But yes, I totally agree. You'll wish you knew more about your parents later.
Yeah.
And it might be too late by the time you realize that.
I felt bad not knowing the answer. I was 42 when my dad died, but I was actually only 38 when my mom died. I just actually did quite. In fact, she did not make it to 70. She was in the neighborhood, but she was 69. So, well, thanks for that, Mr. Robinson. I appreciate the backup there. Okay, what's yours?
Okay,
next one.
This is probably okay. So I really did think of this one pretty quick, and then I thought, does this undermine the entire exercise? But I want to throw it out there because let's expand the thought exercise. Okay, this clearly could never happen, but let's just say you could, like one of these body swapping movies where, the only one I can think of that I can ever remember the title was like Freaky Friday, and again, not advocating any of these, but the idea is, for whatever reason that the plot has conjured, you wake up and you're in your mom's body, and mom wakes up and she's in her
so you have to swap somehow, right?
You have to swap somehow. And Big was like that. It's what would happen if you were suddenly in a full-grown man's body, but you were still 10 or whatever he was.
They're very popular movies in their time. I don't know that I've seen something or even heard of it.
That's true. It doesn't seem to be as popular. Okay. What if you were you pick your own age? I don't even want to pick an age because it's going to throw off. It's like, I would never want to be 12 again or 16 again or whatever. But imagine that you were young enough that you could like reset a lot of things, but you get to retain your experience. Okay. So maybe how would you approach high school differently? Would you approach your college years differently? What would this mean for going into your adult years? Well, if I knew all that, I would practice the Mr. Smith, let's put $100 away at the age 18 and be a millionaire by the time, we're 50 or whatever. Except that life doesn't work that way. And so one of my things is, what would I tell myself? Well, the fact is, I'm sitting here where I am now as a result of all those life experiences. So maybe for me, and in fact, I would say that this is likely, since I like to think of God sometimes when he's working with you, he's like the ultimate personal trainer. He knows exactly how to customize a program for you that's going to bring about the greatest possibility that you're going to end up where he wants you to be. Because sometimes we resist God and we're not as cooperative. But, for me, I did need to learn in my early years a lot of very difficult lessons the hard way. I think I did. And then, you get to a different age and then God works with you a different way. And so you'd go, well, if I went back in time and could just alter whatever I wanted to because I know how to sidestep various things, would I have turned out the same way? And then don't think about it too hard because,
Right, of course.
there's a lot of stuff I look back on and I was like, man, I wish I done it a different way. But then 5 years or sometimes 10 years later, you're like, oh, well, I wouldn't want to live through that again, but I can understand why it went that way. My wife and I had one thing in one year in particular that was extremely difficult, and I would never want to live through that again ever. But yet, it really spurred growth and change in my life. So, at the risk of like taking advantage of this whole topic, do your best and listen to what we're saying, and try not to learn everything the hard way. Yet at the same time, sometimes God gives you the experiences you need to get you to where He wants you to be.
I think that it sounds like a perspective setting kind of point you're trying to give there, Mr. Robinson. Like, for instance, and I see why you're hesitant, because I can see it being misused, what you're saying. I remember when I was teaching high school, there was a young lady in one of my classes, and she had just ended some sort of boyfriend girlfriend relationship that we do not recommend. By the way, we don't recommend going the teenage boyfriend girlfriend route. There's a lot of you want some good advice about that, read Mr. Jonathan McNair's Tomorrow's Youth Today, actually probably Tomorrow's Family Today by then, in the Tomorrow's World magazine, about Should We Kiss Dating Hello. I think I've linked to it before on livingyouth.org. But anyway, so I'm not recommending that. I'm speaking of when I was teaching in the worldly world, out there teaching math. And anyway, she was talking about their relationship, and it was terrible. I mean, everything she talked about just sounded awful. It sounded like things she should never have had to experience. And that you hope you can rear your son or daughter so they don't experience these things. But then she talked about it like, but at the same time, I don't know that I would change anything. I think it's like, well, okay, yeah, no, you should change all that. I mean, the decisions that brought you to that point, you should change. What you're trying to say is that in all of these terrible, terrible things, you are taking away things of value, and that's good. Mm-hmm. But don't use that to somehow kind of baptize, quote unquote, your previous terrible decisions that got you into that place. Because that's what you should also take away from this is, I should have done something different. Because what I've tried to point out to my children is that when it comes to the benefits that you might have gotten out of some even bad choice, don't think God couldn't have given you those benefits some other way. It's not like you're trapped, like God's like, oh, I'm so glad he decided to rob that liquor store because now I can teach him about this or that. It's like, well, no, God would rather you have not robbed the liquor store. At the same time, once it's in your past, it's not going away. It's there. And there are things that you can gain from that. But so I understand the concern that it could be misused, but that's not what you're talking about. It's so easy to look back, even now. Here I am, I'm in my 50s, and there's so many choices. I wish I'd have gone a different direction. So many different things. I'm not saying I'm not happy I'm here. I am intensely happy I'm here. But there's so many choices that it's like, man, that was so much more complicated than it needed to be. Or, I just, every time I look at this person now, I got to think of this terrible, it's like, anyway, regardless, whatever it is. But at the same time, God has used all of that to weave this kind of rich fabric that is now the tapestry of my life. And even in his mercy, some of the choices I wish I hadn't made, he has allowed me to gain some knowledge and some learning. And the Bible even kind of talks about how when it comes to the glory of old men, it's their gray hair, because that's wisdom and stuff. The young men, it's their strength. Yep. It's not their wisdom, And so there should be a willingness to, like the way you summarized the point there, make sure you're thinking of life as a journey and not just as you're constantly in the final destination. You're in a growing kind of habit.
A real dangerous mindset to fall in is that you're a victim and you can't do anything about your circumstances.
Right. Oh, that is a dangerous mindset. And very popular today to think that way.
That you made me think of a couple things. One, actually, you can look at David's life as sort of an example of this, which was really early on, he did a pretty fantastic job. Like if you read through his story, the narrative a couple of times makes it clear that he behaved wisely. And so a lot of what came on him from Saul was not because David was just young and brash. But then later in his life, you see him make a couple of key mistakes with the handling of his kids and their friction and their interactions, and he didn't step in on it. getting distracted from what he was doing with Bathsheba, and then the consequences and results of that, even there at the end of his life, as he numbered the nations and everything. David wasn't a perfect guy by any means, but like God brought him to where he wanted to be through some of these mistakes.
Oh, sorry, continue.
No, you should do that, because my comment is very different. The second one.
Okay. Well, then all I was going to say is that, yeah, I was of the sort ready to beat myself up a whole lot about something, and when I was younger, and it's easy to think that, well, there's no coming back from this, and that's actually not the case. And the verse that came to mind is one that it seems like, Paul's really ragging on some things, because they're all bad, what he says, but he tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 6, he's reminding them, don't you know the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Don't be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God. But then he reminds them, verse 11 is the kicker, and such were some of you.
Yep.
But he says, but you were washed, you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus and by the Spirit of our God. Nothing he says there is meant to say all that stuff's okay. It's the opposite.
Yeah.
If anyone knows these things are terrible, you guys should, because such were some of you. And yet you have been washed. And I think of the Corinthians he's talking about, those who are going to be in the kingdom, then how much more are they going to be equipped based on some of those things to help some of those who have been stuck in those things? But the difference is not, we got to be willing to make gigantic mistakes. We're not trying to say that. But don't write yourself off. God clearly didn't write them off for all of this. Those experiences they had, the mistakes, along with the good things, they have become part of their life. And then the question really is, what do you do with that, right? How do you build on that? How does your advice to others change because of that experience, et cetera? So I don't know. It just prompted me to think of that verse.
That kind of covers what we wanted to talk about. My fourth one, if we'd had time for it, which we really don't, because you have somewhere you have to be. But it's because you mentioned the boyfriend-girlfriend thing, and we don't encourage that, and that's exactly right.
I want to check on my ride, and we do still have a little time.
Okay. I think we could make a quick hitting point on this if you want. So you talked about a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and that I actually thought about that earlier with one of the things I would convince myself, or you would try to, you wish you knew, right? That's what
the things we wish we knew, right?
Things we wish you knew. Is that going back into high school, I felt like kind of a weirdo because I wasn't trying to find a girlfriend, or I didn't have a girlfriend, when the most common thing in the world in high school was you had a boyfriend or girlfriend. Like
right.
Everybody had one. But then when you get older, and especially the more you understand God's way of life and the way you're supposed to do things, you realize that's actually a pretty terrible idea when you're in high school and you're too young and you're dating, and like the pressure of what society is saying is normal versus, let's see, common is the one way you could put it. Like, what is normal? Well, we would say that normal is God's way of life, but right now nobody's normal.
Regrettably, that's a good way to put it.
But the other thing, which was related to this, was, when because a lot of older people try to convince me of this, and you could not, that some of the music we were listening to, some of the movies we were watching, TV shows, guess what? They really are trying to influence you. Mm-hmm. They really are. And the pressure from the culture was extreme, but it's so subtle and so entertaining, because it is entertainment.
Yeah, they make it that way.
You don't pick up on it, and you begin to think that's what normal is, and you think that you're also impervious to it. Like, well, they can't. I know better. They can't influence me. Yeah, they can. They're very good at it. Like in fact, that was 35 years ago. Imagine where we are now, where they're very, very good at it. Like, social media companies are experts. They know exactly how to keep you clicking and scrolling, and they hijack your dopamine system so you feel like you're doing something even though you're not doing anything, and they are influencing you. And that's one thing. The pressure in high school, now I know a lot of our kids are not going to public school, but I was, and the pressure of to conform to what my peers were doing, the pressure was strong, but I underestimated it back then, and some of the things they were trying to, like the most common thing in the world growing up in Tyler, Texas, on a Friday night you went to the high school football game. That was a big deal. And then if you were lucky, you had a friend with a car, and you would go out to the lake and you would drink too much. That's what everybody did. But they made it seem like the most amazing, like you were missing out, the most amazing fun thing in the world. That's where only when I got older did I look back and was very thankful that my parents were relatively, I don't want to say strict, but they had a tight control on us in an appropriate way and did not allow us to get in to go do that kind of stuff. Avoided a lot of trouble.
You know, I'm very appreciative you say that, because having taught high school and seeing what was normal for kids. I remember my first year teaching. I won't even describe what the young guy said, but it was I taught a class on SAT preparation of all things, because with their new block schedule, they had room for lots more classes, and so they created some new ones. And one of them was to help prepare kids to take the SAT, and asked me to teach the math part of that. And this one guy, oh man, it was not like an honors class or a low-level class. It was just kind of a motley crew. And there was some off time in the class because it was a brand new class, and there's times when our material didn't take as long as we thought. And so while I was doing something, the class was off, and one guy was talking about a party that they had. And then, by the way, dating-wise, we're talking about like 1992. So this is years ago. And if you tell me if you think culture's gotten better or worse since then. But I won't repeat what he said, what was going on, how the party had developed, and what they were participating in. But I was appalled. And I'd been in high school myself only, not long before that, right? Because I was fresh out of college teaching this class. And yet I was appalled. But at the same time, I realized, well, a lot of people, they were just listening, and they weren't appalled. It was kind of normal for them. It might have been a little further than normal, but it was still within the realm of normality. But the way you said it, if anything, the thought that, I this isn't going to affect me because I'm aware, I know. No, actually, one of the fastest channels to being affected is the thought, this won't affect me. What Paul tells all of us in Romans 12 is very explicit in verse 2. He says, do not be conformed to this world. Well, the idea of being conformed to the world is kind of like Play-Doh in a mold, being pressed into it and taking its shape. And the world has a shape for us. The world has a shape for us, for you as young people. And all of these things, the entertainment, the way our friends talk around us, all these things that are kind of indirect, the music we're listening to, it is subtly kind of like pushing the Play-Doh into the mold, just very gently, not strongly, but very gently. And there is a stark difference between God's values and the world's values. And man, I that resonates so much in my own life, Mr. Robinson. When I was young, it took me a while. Even every once in a while, I'll discover something new, actually. But it took a while for me to realize just how much the world had been working on me for the 18 or so years I was not attending the church, and how much I actually had accepted, having no idea that I was swallowing this kind of value system in different ways.
Yeah. You and I have talked a bunch of times about, since we've been around longer, and also that you get TV shows from decades earlier. Even though I was born in 71, still in the 80s, they were replaying shows from the 70s. And how we've come along in TV shows, going from a lot more family focused to less family focused to 70s in particular began to normalize. I don't even want to say divorce, because not everything was about divorce, but everything from 8 is Enough to Brady's Bunch, and there's a third one that was very common.
Facts Alive? I don't know. That's kind of later.
It was 80s,
no, that was not. Yeah,
but the idea was
later.
Maybe a spouse had died, and I was talking to Mr. Bomer about this, and he said that actually the Brady Bunch, they were vague about.
Were they calculatedly vague about where the other spouses were?
Because she was married, and she comes in with her 3 kids, and he was married, and he comes in with his 3, and they make a family out of it, and they make the Brady Bunch.
Right.
But then by the 80s, divorce is very common in the shows, and then by the 90s, it's kind of a free-for-all in terms of like all of a sudden the sexual immorality is portrayed all the time. But anyway, TV has moved us along over the decades, as well as the movies.
Sadly so. Well, there you have it, young people listening. Mr. Robbins and I have now divested all of our wisdom. We don't have anything left? There's nothing, everything else we...
Let's hope that's not true.
Yeah, let's hope that's not true.
We have more podcasts in our future.
Yeah, we do. And I do hope we can do this as a series every once in a while, and say something like this. And hopefully, too, I didn't think of it until this morning, we really should do one, Mr. Robinson, where we say, I'm glad I knew this. I'm glad I knew that, and sound a little more. Hopefully, there's at least one thing you can come up with, and I can come up with that we're glad
maybe
we knew.
I'll have to think about it.
Smith and Robinson.